Claire had always known that living in the remote Crystal Mountains would eventually bring danger to her door. She was one of the last pure blood elves left in the known galaxy, a creature of ancient magic and impossible power. 300 years of life had taught her many things, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when the sky itself seemed to crack open, and something fell from the stars like a burning stone. The dragons felt it before she did. Crimson, the eldest of her 3 companions, lifted his massive bronze head and released a sound that was somewhere between a roar and a warning. His body, scarred from countless battles in the old times, tensed with readiness for conflict. Nova, the smallest of the trio with her deep crimson scales that seemed to glow in the twilight, pressed herself against Claire's leg. The heat from Nova's body was always comforting, a reminder that she was not truly alone in this vast and lonely universe. Storm, the silver dragon whose eyes held the color of electricity and whose wings could cut through steel, launched himself into the air and began to circle overhead. Claire stood at the edge of her home, a place carved into the heart of the mountain over decades of patient work. The structure was neither human nor elf in its design, but rather a blend of both cultures, incorporating the strength and practicality of human engineering with the beauty and harmony of ancient elf traditions. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of the rare flowers that grew only in these mountains. Behind her, the entrance to her sanctuary was protected by layers of magic that would take an army weeks to penetrate. But she had a feeling that whatever was coming would not be stopped by such conventional defenses. The impact point was about 2 kilometers away on the northern slope. Claire could see the crater forming from where she stood, a massive hole torn into the mountainside with enough force to trigger small avalanches on either side. Smoke rose from the location, dark and thick and carrying that same metallic smell that had made the dragons nervous all through the night. She had woken in her chambers before dawn, unable to sleep, filled with an inexplicable sense of dread that had settled into her bones like ice. She walked down the mountain path with Crimson on her left and Nova on her right, while Storm continued his protective circles above. The path was treacherous and narrow, designed that way intentionally so that only those who knew the way could traverse it safely. The rocks beneath her bare feet were warm from the morning sun, and she could feel the pulse of the mountain itself through her connection to the earth. Every stone, every crystal, every vein of mineral told stories if one knew how to listen. The mountain was afraid. The mountain sensed wrongness. As they approached the crater, Claire began to see the debris field scattered across the landscape. Pieces of metal unlike anything she had ever encountered were scattered like broken toys. The material had a quality that seemed almost alive, shifting in color and texture depending on the angle of the light. Some pieces were still smoking, and others gave off an energy that made even the dragons hesitant to approach too closely. At the center of the crater sat the thing that had fallen from the sky. At first, Claire could not comprehend what she was looking at. Her mind struggled to process the shape and form of the creature, because it seemed to violate basic principles of biology and physics. The body was sleek and dark, covered in what appeared to be living armor that flowed and shifted like liquid metal. 4 arms extended from the central torso, and each arm ended in weapons so perfectly designed for killing that they seemed to be the only reason those limbs existed. The creature was unconscious or possibly dead, its chest heaving with slow, deep breaths that suggested life but not consciousness. Claire approached carefully, her elf senses extended to their fullest. She could read the magical signatures in the air, could sense the flows of power that animated the creature's form. What she found was disturbing. The being before her was mostly machine, mostly artificial, but woven through its structure was something organic and suffering. There was a consciousness trapped inside this construct, a mind that was screaming silently in ways that only other magical beings could detect. The creature was enslaved to its own body. The red eyes of the assassin suddenly opened and they locked onto Claire with the precision of targeting systems. The creature moved with liquid speed, rising from its crouched position and raising all 4 weapons simultaneously. Nova released a shriek of pure fear and backed away, pulling on Claire's arm with surprising strength for such a young dragon. Storm descended like an arrow aimed at the creature's head, his silver body cutting through the air faster than sound itself. Crimson lowered his head and began charging forward, his horns aimed directly at the assassin's center of mass. The creature fought with a perfection that bordered on impossible. Each movement was calculated. Each strike was designed to cause maximum damage with minimum wasted effort. It was clear that this being had been designed and trained for nothing but violence and death. Its weapons found their marks with terrifying accuracy, and the energy they released burned through the morning air like lightning made solid. Crimson took a blow across his left wing that sent him tumbling backward, golden blood spraying across the rocks beneath his body. The wound was deep and serious, and Claire could feel his pain through their bond, a connection that was more than physical or emotional. They were linked at a fundamental level, their very essences intertwined by years of companionship and love. When Crimson suffered, she suffered. When he was threatened, every protective instinct in her being screamed for her to fight back. Nova gathered her courage despite her fear and rushed at the creature from its blind side. The small dragon's fangs found purchase against the assassin's armor, and she tore away a chunk of the shifting metal. The creature emitted a sound that might have been pain, or might have been something else entirely, a frequency that made the air itself vibrate and shake. It turned its attention to Nova, and for a moment Claire thought her heart would stop entirely. She raised her hands and spoke the old language, the tongue of creation that predated even the oldest human civilization. The ground beneath the assassin's feet became unstable, turning to mud and then to water and then to something that was neither. Vines erupted from the earth, thick as tree trunks and moving with deadly purpose. The sky above darkened as storm clouds that had no business forming gathered overhead. Lightning crackled between Claire's fingers, ancient power that had slumbered inside her for decades now awakened by the threat to those she loved. But the creature adapted faster than it should have been able to. Its armor shifted to repel the vines, burning them away with some kind of energy discharge. Its feet found purchase on the unstable ground through sheer will and physical superiority. The lightning that Claire hurled seemed to pass through it harmlessly, absorbed by systems so advanced that they made human technology look like stone tools. Storm was struck by one of the creature's weapons and thrown backward with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. The silver dragon landed hard against the cliff face, and for a terrible moment Claire thought he would not rise again. But he did, shaking his head to clear it, his eyes burning with determination despite the pain that was clearly radiating through his body. The creature began to advance on Claire directly, and she knew in that moment that this was the moment of true danger. Everything that had happened before was just the prelude. This was the actual attack, the true test of whether she and her dragons would survive or whether they would become just another entry in some assassin's tally of completed contracts. The weapons raised high, and Claire prepared herself to make a final stand against an enemy that had come from the stars themselves to end her life. The assassin's weapons came down like the judgment of some distant and uncaring god, aimed with perfect precision at the center of Claire's body. She had only moments to react, and she used every ounce of her 300 years of experience to move her body out of the direct path of the strikes. Even so, one blade caught her across the ribs and she felt the sting of poison begin to spread through her bloodstream. The toxin was unlike anything she had ever encountered, a biological weapon engineered by minds far more advanced than any she had studied in her long life. Crimson roared with fury as he saw his bondmate struck, and the sound of his voice carried such power that rocks began to tumble down from the higher peaks of the mountain. The great bronze dragon threw himself between Claire and the assassin, his massive body serving as a shield for the woman he loved. The creature's weapons found purchase against Crimson's scales, and the metal scraping sound echoed across the valley like a bell, tolling for the end of days. Golden blood continued to flow from Crimson's earlier wound, but the dragon did not retreat. He pressed forward, using his strength to force the assassin backward. Nova, despite her small size and her natural fear, attacked with the ferocity of a creature fighting not just for her own survival, but for the survival of her entire family. She bit and clawed and burned with dragon fire that turned stone to ash. Storm descended from above again, having recovered from his earlier impact, and slammed into the creature with his full weight. All three dragons were now coordinating their attack, working together with the kind of perfect synchronization that only came from years of hunting together and protecting each other through countless dangers. Claire forced herself to ignore the spreading poison and focus on her magic. The ancient power of her bloodline began to flow through her hands and out into the world around her. She created barriers of pure force that surrounded the assassin, walls of compressed air that would crush ordinary matter like eggshells. She spoke words that had been forgotten by most of the galaxy, words that could reshape reality itself. The ground beneath the creature's feet became a maze of pillars and drops, designed to confuse its targeting systems and disrupt its perfect balance. For the first time, the assassin seemed to hesitate. Its movements became slightly less precise, as if something was interfering with the processes that controlled its body and directed its weapons. The red eyes flickered, and for just a moment Claire could see something else underneath. A consciousness struggling against the chains that bound it to this life of violence and death. But the hesitation was brief. The creature adapted once more, pushing through the barriers and continuing its relentless advance. It was becoming clear that this enemy was designed to overcome any obstacle, engineered to defeat any threat that might be thrown against it. The poison in Claire's bloodstream was spreading faster now, and she could feel her strength beginning to drain away like water from a broken vessel. She knew she was going to die. The knowledge came to her with a strange sort of peace. She had lived 300 years, seen wonders and horrors beyond the comprehension of most beings in the galaxy. She had loved and been loved in return by creatures that should never have chosen to stay with her. That was more than most beings ever received in their entire existence. When this was over, when her body fell still and her magic ceased to flow, at least she would die knowing that she had given everything to protect those she loved. Crimson seemed to sense her weakening. The dragon let out a cry that was part roar and part prayer, a sound that contained desperation and fury and love all mixed together into something that transcended simple emotion. He threw himself even more fully into the battle, pushing the assassin back inch by inch. Nova fought with renewed intensity, her small body glowing with an inner light that came from determination rather than any physical source. Storm's lightning began to rain down around them all, the silver dragon no longer caring whether his electricity might strike his bondmates because he was too consumed with the need to protect Claire. The battle raged back and forth across the mountainside, destroying everything in its path. Stone was crushed to powder. Living rock was turned to molten slag. The very air itself seemed to scream under the force of the energies being unleashed. The dragons and the elf woman fought with a coordination that seemed impossible, each knowing what the others were about to do before they moved, each anticipating the enemy's reactions by fractions of a second. And then something changed. The assassin's movements became jerky and uncoordinated. The red eyes flickered rapidly through a spectrum of colors, cycling through hues that had no name in any language spoken by any known species. The creature's armor began to ripple and wave like liquid, losing its perfect control. For a moment it seemed as if the creature might be malfunctioning, as if the damage done by the dragons and Claire's magic had finally broken through its carefully engineered systems. But as Claire forced herself to stay conscious, despite the poison and the pain, she began to understand the truth. This was not a malfunction. This was something else entirely. The creature was breaking free from something, fighting against something that had held it captive for so long that it had forgotten what freedom even meant. The assassin fell to its knees, and the weapons dropped from its forearms to clatter uselessly against the stone. The creature's body began to shake, and Claire realized with a shock that it was crying. Actual tears were falling from those red eyes, tears that should have been impossible from such a construct but were there nonetheless. The creature was weeping, releasing pain and grief and despair that had been locked away inside it for decades. It tried to speak, and the first sounds were distorted by its damaged voice systems. But as it continued to try, the words became clearer. The language it was using was ancient and almost forgotten, but Claire understood it perfectly. The creature called itself Kesh and had been imprisoned inside this body for 40 years, forced to kill and kill and kill without end, without hope, without any ability to refuse. Crimson and Nova and Storm all ceased their attacks simultaneously, understanding in the way that magical creatures understand such things that something fundamental had changed. The threat of death had transformed into something else, something that required a different response than pure violence. Claire, struggling against the poison that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness, began to speak the words of healing and protection. She did not know if they would work on a creature so fundamentally artificial, but she had to try. She had to offer something other than death to this being that had come through the sky with violence on its mind, but had apparently never wanted any of this to happen in the first place. The healing magic that Claire poured into Kesh's body was unlike anything the creature had ever experienced. For 4 decades, every sensation that flowed through its artificial form had been pain or numbness or the cold grip of control. But this magic was different. It was warm and alive and carried with it a quality of acceptance that Kesh's mind could barely comprehend. The poison that had been spreading through Claire's own bloodstream began to reverse its course, drawn out of her body by the same healing magic that was now flowing into Kesh. She fell to her knees as the effort of channeling that much power drained her reserves, and the poison that had been inside her now began to dissipate harmlessly into the air around them. Crimson caught her as she started to collapse, his massive body providing support and comfort. Nova pressed against her other side, and Storm descended from the sky to wrap his wings around all of them in a gesture that was more protective than aggressive. Kesh lay on the ground, and for a long moment nothing moved except the wind and the dust that continued to settle across the devastated landscape. Then slowly, carefully, the creature's breathing began to regulate itself. The armor that covered its body started to shift, becoming less hostile and rigid, beginning to resemble something more like clothing than a weapon. The forearms remained, but the weapons attached to them began to retract, folding back into the body as if they had never been. When Kesh finally spoke again, the voice was different. It was no longer the cold, mechanical sound of a death machine, but something almost alive, something that carried emotion and history and the weight of terrible suffering. Kesh told them that name had once been something else, something that meant beauty in a language that had not been spoken in 300 years. The being explained that it had been taken as a child from a planet called Vesh, a world that no longer existed because it had been destroyed by the very corporation that had transformed Kesh into a weapon. The corporation was called the Vicari Collective, and they specialized in creating perfect assassins by combining biological creatures with advanced technology and breaking their minds until nothing remained but the desire to obey. Kesh had been kept in a state between consciousness and unconsciousness for 4 decades, forced to execute contracts and return to the facility where technicians would repair damage and readjust the neural pathways that controlled behavior. The creature had developed a slow-growing awareness over the years, a tiny spark of something that had always been suppressed but never fully extinguished. That spark had grown stronger with each killing, each act of violence making the imprisoned consciousness scream a little louder against its chains. Something had happened during the journey to this planet. During the crash and the impact of falling from the stars, some circuit had been disrupted, some failsafe had been triggered. For the first time in decades, Kesh had felt something other than the cold command structure that governed its body. For the first time, the creature had felt fear, and when fear finally penetrated the barriers that had held Kesh captive, hope had followed close behind it. Claire listened to this entire story while her dragons arranged themselves protectively around her and the wounded assassin. As she listened, she made a decision that would alter the course of not just her own life, but the political balance of the entire galactic region. She would offer Kesh sanctuary. She would offer the creature a chance to become something other than a weapon, a chance to discover who it had been before the Vicari Collective had stolen its life. The humans had always told her that this was what made their species special, what made them exceptional among all the intelligent beings in the known universe. Humans chose to believe in redemption. Humans chose to offer second chances even when logic suggested such choices were foolish and dangerous. Humans looked at broken things and saw not trash to be discarded, but possibilities for transformation and healing. Claire was elf by birth, but human in her philosophy. She had spent the last 100 years in companionship with humans, learning their ways and adopting their optimistic approach to a universe that could be cold and uncaring and terrible. Now she was going to test whether that philosophy could stretch far enough to encompass even something like Kesh, an assassin created by nightmares and suffering. She extended her hand to the creature and spoke in the ancient language that Kesh had used, pronouncing the syllables carefully even though they felt strange on her elf tongue. She spoke Kesh's true name, the name that meant beauty, and invited the creature to rise and walk down the mountain with her and her dragons. Kesh looked at the offered hand as if it might be some kind of weapon, as if accepting it might trigger another round of violence or pain. The creature's artificial eyes cycled through colors again, but this time the progression was slower, more contemplative. Finally, slowly, with movements that were careful and deliberate, Kesh reached out with one of its 4 hands and grasped Claire's fingers. The touch was strange, Kesh's palm was covered in plating that was still slightly warm from recent combat, and the grip was careful, controlled, demonstrating awareness of strength that could crush bone with minimal effort. But underneath that careful control was something else, a kind of gentleness that suggested the creature was learning what it meant to not use every advantage in the violence of connection. They walked down the mountain together, a strange and impossible group. An ancient elf woman, 3 dragons of different sizes and colors, and an alien assassin learning for the first time what it might mean to belong to something other than a command structure and a list of targets. Behind them, the crater that had marked Kesh's arrival began to be reclaimed by the mountain itself, stones shifting and settling, earth beginning to cover the signs of violence. It took them 3 days to reach Claire's sanctuary. During those 3 days, Kesh spoke almost constantly, pouring out 3 decades of memories and thoughts that had been locked away inside its constructed body. The creature experienced its first meal that was not purely nutritional, its first silence that was not filled with combat calculations, its first experience of something that might be called peace. The dragons were patient teachers. Storm showed Kesh how to fly, how to move through the air with grace rather than the brutal efficiency of combat maneuvers. Crimson taught through his example what it meant to be a companion rather than a weapon, what the value of loyalty might be when it was given freely rather than programmed. Nova, with her natural fearlessness despite her small size, showed that gentleness and strength were not opposite qualities but could coexist in the same being. By the time they reached the sanctuary and Kesh crossed the threshold for the first time, the creature had begun to understand something fundamental about existence that the Vicari Collective had tried very hard to prevent. Kesh had begun to understand that it was a being with choice, with the ability to decide its own future, rather than simply receiving commands from above. The sanctuary that Claire had built over many decades began to transform the moment Kesh entered its protected walls. The creature's artificial systems, which had been designed only for violence and destruction, began to adapt and evolve in ways that even Claire had not anticipated. The sanctuary itself, which was woven through with layers of ancient magic, seemed to recognize something in Kesh that needed healing, and began the process on its own. Claire showed Kesh the gardens where she grew the rare flowers that only flourished in these mountains. She explained that each plant represented a year of her life spent learning patience, understanding the slow and careful work of creation rather than destruction. Kesh's 4 hands, which had been shaped for weapons and violence, began to learn the delicate work of tending growing things. The creature moved through the gardens like someone learning a completely new language, careful and thoughtful and sometimes damaging things despite the best intentions. But Claire never showed anger when Kesh crushed a fragile stem or accidentally uprooted a seedling. Instead, she would simply show the creature how to help the plant recover, how to use the healing magic that flowed through her bloodline to mend what had been broken. Over weeks and then months, Kesh began to understand that mistakes were not failures, but opportunities to learn and do better. This was a revelation to a being whose entire existence had been defined by the demand for perfection and the punishment of any deviation from exactly what the Vicari Collective required. Crimson, the eldest dragon, took on the role of Kesh's primary teacher in matters of emotional expression and companionship. The bronze dragon, scarred from countless battles, would spend hours with Kesh in the sanctuary's great chamber, simply sitting in companionable silence or engaging in slow, careful conversation about what it meant to choose one's own path through life. Crimson had his own history of violence and pain, had his own scars that ran deeper than the wounds visible on his body. When the dragon looked at Kesh, he saw not a monster or a threat, but a reflection of what he had been before Claire had found him wounded and broken on an ancient battlefield. Nova, with the brilliant instincts of the young, began to teach Kesh about play and joy and the simple pleasure of movement without purpose other than the joy of moving. She would race the creature through the halls of the sanctuary, her small body darting and weaving while Kesh's larger frame moved with growing grace and flexibility. Slowly, the creature that had been designed for perfect, efficient killing began to develop the kind of waist motion that characterized joy and freedom. Kesh began to laugh, a sound that started as something between a mechanical beep and a desperate cry, but gradually became something warm and genuine. Storm, the silver dragon with eyes like electricity, became Kesh's companion in the night skies. The dragon taught the creature that there was beauty in simply existing without purpose, That starlight and wind and the infinite expanse of the universe were valuable experiences in themselves. Kesh would stand on the highest peaks of the sanctuary with Storm beside it, and for the first time the creature's sensory systems registered information that had nothing to do with threat assessment or tactical advantage. Kesh saw stars not as distant fire but as distant beauty. The wind was not a factor in trajectory calculation but a caress against skin and scales. Months turned into a year, and then into 2 years. Claire began to integrate Kesh fully into her life, treating the creature not as a guest who needed to be managed, but as a true member of their small family. She taught Kesh the history of the elves, the ancient stories of a race that had walked among the stars when most other species were still learning to make fire. She shared the languages of creation and destruction, the magic that had sustained her bloodline for millennia. Kesh began to change in ways that went deeper than simple behavioral modification. The creature's artificial armor started to shift and reconfigure, adapting to no longer need to be a weapon. Parts of it became more decorative, flowing lines that served no purpose other than beauty. The forearms, which had caused Kesh so much grief during those first months of learning to not be a weapon, began to be used for art and music and the creation of beautiful things rather than destruction. But not all of Kesh's time was spent in peaceful pursuits. One day, about 2 years into Kesh's time at the sanctuary, a message arrived from the outside world. It was a communication from a human military official named Governor Miranda, who governed the region of space near the Crystal Mountains. The message was simple and direct. The Vicari Collective was searching for their lost assassin, and they had tracked the trail to Claire's sanctuary. They were offering substantial payment to anyone who would return Kesh to them, alive or dead, or alternatively they would come themselves and take what was theirs. Claire felt her heart sink as she read the message. She had known that eventually the outside world would intrude upon the peace they had built, but she had not expected it so soon, or with such a direct threat. She showed the message to Kesh and waited to see how the creature would respond. Kesh was quiet for a very long time. The creature walked to the highest tower of the sanctuary and stood looking out at the stars for hours. When Kesh finally returned, there was a new determination in the way it moved. The creature had made a choice, a real choice made freely with full understanding of the consequences. Kesh would not hide. Kesh would not run back to the Vicari Collective. Instead, Kesh would face the corporation and offer them something they had never expected. Kesh would offer them proof that their perfect assassin had transformed into something else, something that demonstrated the failure of their entire system of control and domination. Claire gathered her dragons and prepared for what she knew would be coming. She sent a message to Governor Miranda, extending an invitation to meet with Kesh and witness the transformation that had occurred. She also sent messages to every human ally she had made over the decades, calling them to bear witness to what happened next. When the Vicari Collective's representatives arrived at the sanctuary 2 weeks later, they found not a weapon to reclaim, but a being of impossible beauty who had chosen to exist beyond their control. What happened in the days that followed would change the entire political landscape of the galactic region and prove to everyone who witnessed it that even the most thoroughly enslaved mind could choose freedom when given the chance to believe that such a choice was possible. The representative from the Vicari Collective arrived in a ship that was all sharp angles and threatening weapons, a vessel that was designed to intimidate through its very appearance. The figure that emerged was humanoid but clearly artificial in construction, a being that had been built rather than born. Its name was Registrar Thorn, and it had overseen the creation and programming of dozens of assassins just like Kesh. Thorn approached the sanctuary with absolute confidence, carrying contracts and authorization codes that gave the Vicari Collective legal claim to any asset that had been created in their facilities. The registrar expected simple compliance or a brief, violent conflict that would end with Kesh being retrieved and the elf woman facing consequences for harboring stolen corporate property. What Thorn found instead was Kesh, standing at the entrance of the sanctuary in full view, but transformed so completely that recognition took several moments. The creature that had been designed as a perfect assassin was now wearing clothes that had been woven by the dragons from natural fibers of the mountain flowers. Kesh's weapons had been removed and the ports where they had connected sealed with material that seemed to be a hybrid of elf magic and advanced technology. The forearms, which had been the most distinctive feature of the assassin form, were now adorned with decorative patterns that told stories of the journey from slavery to freedom. Kesh did not run or attempt to hide. Instead, the creature walked forward and met Registrar Thorn directly, speaking in a voice that was strong and clear and completely its own. Kesh told the registrar that the contract was invalid because Kesh was no longer property of the Vakari Collective. The creature explained that consciousness and choice were fundamental rights that could not be surrendered, that could not be programming overridden by any corporate contract. Registrar Thorn threatened immediate violence. The registrar called for the ship's weapons to be activated and demanded that all forces in the vicinity prepare for combat. But nothing happened. The crew of the Vakari ship had been instructed by Governor Miranda that any act of violence against the sanctuary would result in immediate military intervention by the human forces that had surrounded the location. The representatives of 3 different human governments were present as witnesses, along with numerous members of the Galactic press, all of whom had been invited by Claire to witness what she called a historical moment. Thorn's face darkened with rage, but the registrar was not yet finished. The artificial being explained that even if Kesh was allowed to walk free, the Vakari Collective would ensure that no other being in the galaxy would ever employ the creature. Kesh would be blacklisted, marked, permanently unable to find work or connection with any legitimate organization. The creature would be forced to survive as a wanderer and an outcast. It was at this moment that Claire stepped forward, flanked by her 3 dragons. She explained that Kesh would not be wandering alone because Kesh had found family. She introduced Kesh to the assembled witnesses as a being who had been enslaved and tortured, but had chosen freedom and redemption. Claire announced that she was adopting Kesh officially into her household, making the creature a citizen of her lands and under the protection of her ancient magic and authority. But Claire's offer went further than simple protection. She announced that she was opening her sanctuary to other beings who had been enslaved by the Vakari Collective or any other organization that used forced servitude and control. She declared that her mountain home would become a place of healing and transformation, a sanctuary where broken things could learn to become whole again. The impact of these words rippled through the galactic region like a wave through still water. If one of the most powerful ancient elf women alive was willing to openly defy the Vakari Collective, then perhaps others would find the courage to do the same. If Kesh could transform from assassin to companion, then perhaps redemption was possible for any being willing to choose it. Within weeks, other beings began to arrive at the sanctuary seeking the healing and acceptance that Claire and Kesh had found together. Some were like Kesh, creatures created by corporations to be weapons or tools. Others were beings who had been traumatized by various forms of violence and exploitation. Claire, with the help of Kesh and the dragons, worked to create a community based on healing rather than control, on choice rather than compulsion. Kesh became Claire's partner in this work. The creature used its understanding of how domination systems worked to help other beings escape the psychological chains that had bound them. Kesh taught that transformation was not something that happened to a being, but something that a being chose, moment by moment, day by day. Kesh demonstrated through its own example that even the most thoroughly enslaved mind could choose freedom if given the chance and the support to believe that such choice was possible. Governor Miranda established a military buffer zone around the sanctuary to protect it from any attempts at retrieval or revenge. The governors of multiple human districts competed to offer resources and support to the healing community that was developing in the mountains. The Vakari Collective, finding its market for assassins suddenly, restricted as ethical beings across the galaxy began to refuse to hire the creatures, and as Registrar Thorn's credibility was destroyed by the public revelation of how thoroughly the collective had enslaved their creations, eventually dissolved as a corporate entity. Years passed, and the sanctuary grew into something that had never existed before in the galaxy. It was not a military installation or a government facility, but something uniquely human in its philosophy, even though it was built and maintained by an ancient elf woman and her dragon, companions, and an alien being who had learned to choose gentleness over violence. Claire often sat with Kesh in the gardens during the evening time, watching the sunset paint the crystal mountains in shades of gold and purple. On one such evening, as the dragons rested nearby and other beings moved through the sanctuary pursuing their own paths of healing, Kesh asked Claire why she had chosen to help an assassin, why she had risked so much to offer redemption to a creature created for nothing but violence and death. Claire smiled and explained that she had learned long ago that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy was not their technology or their strength, but their fundamental belief that every being, no matter how broken or seemingly irredeemable, deserved the chance to choose what they wanted to become. She explained that by choosing to help Kesh, she had not just saved one creature, but had demonstrated to every being in the galaxy that transformation was possible if one was willing to believe in it. Kesh reached out with one of its 4 hands and grasped Claire's fingers gently, the way the creature had learned to do on that first day coming down from the mountains. The touch that had once seemed like an act of violence was now an act of connection and gratitude and love. In that moment, under the light of twin moons and surrounded by dragons and healing and family, Kesh understood completely what it meant to belong to something beyond violence, to be part of a community built on choice and acceptance and endless possibilities for who a being might choose to become.